Alrighty, buckle up because this one's going to be a long one. Now, the text field is probably one of the most used fields in the CMS because, well, every project you're working on most likely requires some form of text. And to make things easier within Dato, we offer the text field in 3 different flavors. You've got the single line string, which is great for really short pieces of content like a blog post title or the name of an author. You've got the multiple paragraph text option, which supports Markdown, HTML, and plain text, which is great for things like the description of a blog post or a small content block on a landing page. And finally, you've got the structured text field, which is probably one of my favorite subfields. If you're used to, let's say, the editorial experience of something like a Notion or a Ghost, then this is one of the fields you're really going to enjoy working with. So let's take a closer look at each one of these. For the single line field, we'll just call it something like a title. If you've got localization enabled in your project, it's probably wise to have this field enabled with localization as well. On the validation side, we probably want to have this as a required field because it's going to be really weird if a blog post shows up without a title. And then we'd also want this to be unique. This kind of makes sure that if you've already got an entry called, let's say, example 1, you can't create another one that's called example 1 as well. And if we're worried about the aesthetics of the website or for whatever reason we want these titles to be within a specific range, we can limit the character count to be between a minimum and maximum, or we can also be a bit more specific to have a minimum, a maximum only, or an exact character count. We can also have these fields match a specific pattern. So if we were to have them as a URL, Dato would make sure that all entries would sort of match that expression. We can also have something for an email or a custom regular expression. And finally, you can also have the option to accept specified values. So let's say you're working on something really restrictive or some statistical data, your devs can kind of have a range of options that you can use to sort of set this field. Now let's just go ahead without actually enabling any of them and look at the default value option. Now, in this project, we have localizations for Italian, German, and English, so you can set a default value for each field. This is helpful if you're kind of creating a lot of content in bulk and you just want to create those entries and get back to them to edit at a future date. But it's not something I fully recommend if you have the required validation in place. And finally, we have the presentation. So this is what the field would look like to us as editors when we're creating content. So in this case, the devs might say something like, please use this just for titles. And there would also be the option to see what this field looks like to us. So for a regular title, we would most likely just choose a text input where we can, sort of add our text. But if we were working with things like options, you would have a radio group where if let's say the title can only accept something like product release or product announcement, then this is where you would make a choice to choose one. But if you had multiple options, let's say something like the categories of a blog post, then you could have multiple options and select multiple ones as well. Let's just discard these and take a look at the multiple paragraph text. Now, this is slightly different to the single string because this accepts different formats like HTML and Markdown. So if we were to call this the description field and look at the validations, you'd notice that we have a new one here to prevent the use of dangerous HTML attributes. Now, since HTML is accepted in this field, the devs also have the option to restrict certain tags. So in many cases, there might be some security issues with using tags like a style attribute or any n number of HTML fields. So this is where devs can make sure that the input within the text fields are sanitized and following the conventions they require. Similarly, you can set a default value, but since this is a more of a rich text editor, you have more options to stylize this. And on the presentation side, you can also choose whether you want to use Markdown or HTML or have a simple plain text area. Now, this is important because many different use cases require different types of editing. So if you've got HTML and you use a lot of these style tags, you'd probably want to go ahead with the HTML editor, which also gives you more options on the toolbar, depending on how it's finally rendered on your front end. But if you're using simple text, then you don't need any of those validations and it would just be a plain text field. Now, finally, let's take a look into the structured text field. This one is, we'll just call it content for now, because this is what we on DatoCMS use for almost everything, like our blog posts, our product releases, our docs, most of our landing pages. They're just a bunch of structured text fields because they give such a fun editorial experience. It has very similar validations for what's required and what the character count could be, but the unique bit here is what you can add to the field. So the structured text field accepts blocks that we will create later on. So if you want to add things like quotes or testimonials or videos or images, authors, anything that you create as a block can be added into the structured text field. You can also have links to other models itself. So if we were creating, let's say, a blog post and we wanted to link to a documentation page, that's very possible. If we wanted to create a rich gallery or a bunch of CTAs in here, anything that's created within the CMS as a different model or a block can be embedded within this. You can also have self-references. So in this case, if we're creating a page but want to link to another page, we can simply reference itself within the structured text field. There's also a few other validations to notify you if things aren't going as expected, but we won't get into the details of that. And finally, on the presentation side, you have the same help text that we've seen on the other text fields, but you have default editorial settings. So you can kind of choose whether or not code snippets are allowed or quotes are allowed and what hierarchy this page, this sort of text editor can accept. Now, there are a lot of options when it comes to how you can use the structured text field. So rather than me droning on for the next 10-15 minutes, let's just quickly play the promo video that we put out when we'd released this feature back in the day that does a fantastic job of explaining how this field works. Yeah, that was way better than I would have explained it anyways. So now that we've sort of gotten familiar with how the text field works, let's stop here. And in the next video, we'll take a look at the media field.